Okay, so I'm going to start with that right now. Okay, so second sub-theme of the opening theme, which is changing the economic environment. Essentially, the overarching or the recurring point that comes back with that this sub-theme continues to come back to is that the country throughout this entire century faces a series of significant economic challenges, and it usually deals with how well the government deals with those economic challenges. There is more of a debate about how well they deal with those economic challenges in the interwar period. There's the post-war period. Generally speaking, they don't deal with challenges particularly well. So there's often questions specifically about how well the government deals with them, and also more specifically get questions about what actually is the main cause or main reason behind certain economic challenges coming about in the first place. So the way I'll go through it is by mainly focusing on what challenges arise and how well they're dealt with, but actually in reality you can get specific questions about what causes those problems in the first place. So, first things first, just to sort of start off with, some basic definitions. There are quite a few sort of like phrases and terms and concepts you might sort of like you might find quite confusing as you try to read through this topic yourself or work out what's going on. A few really basic ones that you should really be aware of because they do recur quite often. First of all, obviously national debt. When we use the phrase national debt, we're basically referring to the amount that the government itself owes and must pay back to its creditors. So it's how much money the government itself owes to its creditors, and those can crucially be international or domestic creditors. Very often we talk about the government's national debt and who it owes it to, it's very often to international debt of creditors rather than domestic, aka those at home. Secondly, inflation, of course. Inflation is something which is going to recur over and over and over again during this time. Pretty much inflation is essentially increase in the general price of goods across a period of time. Okay, the rate of inflation is by how much the price or the cost of goods are increasing over a set amount of time. So inflation is very simply the increase in price of goods. Third idea that constantly recurs over and over again, quite an important one, is the idea of balance of payments. So balance of payments is the difference between how much money is entering and exiting through the country. Well, it's the difference between how much money is entering and how much money is exiting a country, and this is usually through the process of trade. So when we talk about balance of payments, it's how much is entering or the difference between how much is entering and how much is exiting the country, and that usually takes place through trade. So if a country, for example, imports or buys from abroad more than it exports, aka it sells to foreign countries, then you would say that that country has a trade imbalance. Okay, they have a trade imbalance because they're basically sending more money out of the country than they're basically taking into it. And so you could also therefore say that the country with the trade imbalance is basically losing money because it sells more than it actually buys. Sorry, it buys more than it actually sells. So again, those are some basic ideas which will constantly come up. Oh, last one, interest rates. So interest rates, this is kind of an important thing to kind of just note because it's something which if you do economics, for example, it can completely throw you off if you understand how interest rates are currently set. Interest rates are basically the proportion of a loan that is charged as interest to the borrowers, which is a very straightforward idea. Really importantly though, traditionally, interest rates are basically set by the government. The government decides what the interest rate is, and banks are expected to comply with that. And the idea is that if you want to make borrowing harder, you raise interest rates. You might, and the reason I make borrowing harder is to kind of decrease spending, and that can be for a range of different reasons, which we'll kind of come back to. And if you want to make borrowing easier, and you want to increase spending, you would therefore decrease interest rates. So those are some basic ideas that will sort of that you'll kind of often read about, and you just kind of expect it to know what they're referring to. If you are unsure of those things, like make sure you look it up because they're the kind of basic points. Okay, so the context of 1918, or straight after the First World War. Britain basically is facing a series of major economic problems after the First World War is basically concluded. The first major issue they're facing is the loss of trade. Britain, of course, during the 19th century and also as an empire, is primarily based upon trade as an economy. However, they basically lose a lot of that trade which they had before the war and during the war. One of the first reasons is because they have highly outdated industries, okay? They've got really outdated industries that haven't really been invested in or developed significantly for a long, long time. That makes their production techniques inefficient. If you have inefficient production techniques, it means it's expensive to actually produce those things, and you have to therefore sell your goods for an expensive price as well. That's the first thing. And the second, as a result, you are selling expensive goods, and to make it worse, you've got foreign competitors, countries like Japan and Germany, etc., taking advantage of your expensive prices to undercut you with their own goods, which are of equal quality in most cases anyway, and sell them instead. During the war in particular, the disruption of trade that takes place really creates a vacuum for countries like Japan to step into. The Germans during the war basically spent a lot of time attacking British merchant shipping, and the kind of vacuum that creates, for example, places like India, the Japanese step into India and start selling cotton, for example, to the Indians instead, which kind of fills that void which the British leave. And so the disruption of trade during the war itself makes it also a problem. This is arguably the biggest problem which they face, and it's a recurring one throughout the period. The second major one is the issue of debt. The British national debt reaches £8 billion by the end of the First World War. To put it into perspective, that's over 10 times what it was before the war began. And basically the debt's massively increased simply because the war went on for longer than they were expecting it to. Obviously the war was kind of hoped, or it was thought to perhaps not go, wasn't going to really last for too long, a couple of years maybe tops. In reality, obviously, it goes on for 4 years, and it becomes a very costly war as well. And so, to prolong the war effort and to keep up the war effort, the British are basically forced to basically rely on American loans. By the end of the First World War, so we said that the national debt is £8 billion. The annual budget, in other words, how much the government spends every single year, was only actually 800 million. Of which a significant chunk has to go towards servicing the debt. So that 8 billion is a very significant amount in terms of the national debt. So that's the second issue. There's the issue of the debt and how that cripples their choices in terms of the government spending plans afterwards. Third thing is the value of the pound falls. Essentially, the British are forced to leave the gold standard after the First World War. Am I going to turn the gold standard later on? Okay, no, I'm not. I'll explain it very briefly. In essence, the gold standard is, if you're on the gold standard, you basically fix, or you essentially tie the value of your currency to the price of gold. So in other words, it's a way of maintaining the stability of your currency and also ensuring that your currency actually maintains quite a high value. And so you can't just kind of go around printing money recklessly because your money's basically got to be tied to your gold reserves in the first place. Britain basically is forced to leave the gold standard, and so as a result, the value of the pound drops from $4.80 per pound to $3.40, which is a significant drop. And then finally, there's the issue of inflation. Inflation is at 25% by the end of the war, which is a huge amount. So you've got this range of issues which the government is facing after the First World War. So, a lot of the measures that successive governments take during the 20s to try and alleviate some of these issues end up being quite ineffective. The first solution which governments attempt to try and solve these problems is protectionism. It's a highly ineffective and actually quite detrimental solution they use to try and improve the situation. This solution is specifically designed to solve the problem of loss of trade and the knock-on effect that has on traditional heavy industries who are suffering due to a loss of trade. The Conservative Party in particular, over the decades before this, have slowly convinced themselves that protectionism is the best way to operate, with free trade having been the order of the day in the 19th century. So protectionism instead, free trade is you allow goods to sort of flow freely without imposing much taxation at all, or the government getting too involved in the flow of goods or trade. Protectionism involves the government imposing tariffs, or in other words taxes, or protective taxes, against foreign goods coming into their country so that their own home industries can be protected by the import of foreign goods coming in. Okay? And so the government or the Conservatives have become obsessed with this idea of protectionism, imposing tariffs to try and protect heavy industries back home. In other words, they can protect how well they do it in the home market itself. And additionally, the particular reason why they're so keen on the idea is because Britain has the advantage of an empire. Protectionism doesn't just stop goods coming into Britain, it stops goods ideally coming into the British Empire, which is again which have many markets that the British have lost during the First World War. So it's trying to stop goods coming into the empire and protecting therefore heavy industry as well and how well business they do in the empire. And so yeah, it increases the cost of imports and encourages therefore the purchase of domestic goods. So in the short term, it would help the struggling industries. In the long term, however, it's a disastrous policy. The reason being is you could argue that what these industries needed most desperately wasn't an easier market to operate with no competition. What they needed was investment to modernise their infrastructure, to make it so that their production methods become more efficient, so that they can actually become more competitive on the international market by becoming better industries, as opposed to relying on, as it were, protection from the government to help you out. And so what happens as a result is that crucial investment never comes. Instead, you have these heavy industries, and when we talk about heavy industries, we mean things like shipbuilding, steel, iron, etc. A lot of these heavy industries basically get away with being rubbish, to put it simply. They don't develop their production methods at all. They remain quite outdated and quite backwards. And so that old long-term problem of lack of efficiency, etc., it never goes away. And so actually it allows that to continue. The second reason why it's quite ineffective is not other countries can also impose tariffs. And so other major industrial nations also decide to erect tariff walls. And so the idea itself doesn't work so well for that purpose. The more significant impact is on the way that it basically prevents a lot of these heavy industries from basically investing more in their production methods.
What's a tariff?
Sorry?
What's a tariff wall?
So yes, the tariff wall is basically the tariff wall is essentially a tax barrier that blocks foreign goods from coming into your country, basically because they're not competitive, because they're too expensive.
So other countries stop British trade or what?
It's not that you stop it. So what you do is you make them less competitive, because what makes goods competitive is having cheaper prices on the international market. If it's cheap, people will buy it. So if you've got these cheap Japanese goods coming into Britain or coming into, say, India, what you do is you put taxes on it so that those goods actually increase in price, and they're no longer so cheap anymore because you now tax them instead. And so other countries can do the exact same thing. So they call them tariff walls because the taxation itself basically acts as a wall almost to prevent those goods from coming in the first place. They don't actually physically stop them. It's a case of people won't buy them anymore, or you'd ideally hope they wouldn't. That's how that one works. Okay, the second solution the government attempts, again, highly ineffective and arguably quite damaging, not just ineffective, is cutting public spending. Essentially, this is really conventional, orthodox economic theory in the 1920s. If the government is spending too much money, what you do, or if the government has high national debt, what you do is you basically cut spending to try and balance the books as soon as possible. If the government's got high national debt, their priority should be to pay it off as soon as possible and not overspend. That is kind of traditional economic thinking or conventional thinking, and that's what the government tries to do. They decide that to combat the national debt situation, which we talked about earlier, they have to try and balance the books as soon as possible. And so the government basically introduces a raft of public spending cuts with their budget in 1921, and it gets nicknamed the Geddes Axe. And it's called that because the guy who comes up with spending cuts is called Sir something Geddes. I can't remember what his first name is. It's named after him, and so essentially it's just like a really kind of like sinister name for this guy coming in and slashing public spending. The spending cuts largely come from the defence budget, but they also, crucially and controversially, affect the health, housing and welfare budgets. In particular, for example, unemployment assistance gets cut during, as a result of this Geddes Axe. Millions get slashed in these budgets. And so this basically exacerbates a lot of the problems of the decade. in particular unemployment. Every time unemployment kind of goes up, obviously people require permanent assistance, but in slashing the amount that's being spent on it, it obviously exacerbates the problem in the first place of unemployment and people's living standards, etc. So the spending cuts basically make life worse for a lot of people. So that's the spending cuts. The third ineffective response, and this is probably the worst out of them all, and it's probably the most catastrophic mistake made in the interwar period by a rather foolish politician called Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill gets made Chancellor in 1925, I think. I think 25, so in 25 Churchill gets made Chancellor of the Exchequer, despite having little experience in the role, and despite his previous high-profile jobs being also complete failures. So he gets put in the role, and Churchill decides that Britain needs to return to the gold standard to try and increase the value of the pound. So there was an issue at the end of the First World War where Britain left the gold standard, and the pound had therefore decreased in value. And so to prop up the value of the pound again, Churchill decides we have to go back onto the gold standard. Part of the reason behind it is to try and make the pound more attractive to foreign investors who would therefore put their money in British banks. They're not going to put their money in, they're not going to want British pounds because they actually have quite high value as a result. So it's to try and kind of make it a bit more attractive. There are a few other reasons as well for why he decided the decision. What's more important though is that the effects again are really problematic. It comes back to the same problem or the same question from beforehand of uncompetitive British industry. So heavy industry is already doing badly because their exports are not competitive on a global stage, or they're too expensive basically to purchase. When Britain goes back onto the gold standard, the pound becomes more valuable, therefore those goods become more expensive again. Okay, with the British pound becoming more valuable, the goods themselves, which were already expensive to begin with, become even more expensive because the pound itself costs more. So if you're buying from outside, it's now harder to sell. Therefore, British goods are now harder to sell globally, in particular against those, not just even globally, even on a domestic market, the imports that are coming from outside the country are also subsequently cheaper. So on both counts, British industry ends up doing quite badly. It becomes harder to sell domestically because cheaper goods come from outside that are cheaper, therefore people will take imports. And it becomes harder to sell globally because your goods are, again, not competitive against, for example, cheap Japanese or German goods, or rather perhaps not German, perhaps like American goods this time. As usual, the people who basically suffer the most, and this is an issue which we'll come back to when we look at industrial relations, are of course the workers. It has a knock-on effect on workers who basically have their wages and or their hours being cut. They either have to accept working less, and therefore getting less, or just have their wages cut in the first place as well. So again, the decision to go back to the gold standard has a disastrous impact, and a lot of people argue that it basically prolongs the economic slump from the 20s. So the gold standard, no good. So that kind of sums up the 20s basically. The range of issues which the government is facing at the start of the 20s, arguably none of their solutions are particularly effective, and they all actually have quite negative side effects as well, or have negative impacts as well. So that's that. That then obviously that then leads us into the next big sort of, or the next major event or checkpoint of this time period, which is the Great Depression or the recession, or the Wall Street crash. So the Wall Street crash itself is no introduction. American stock market crash in Wall Street essentially leads to, or arguably leads to, a prolonged global worldwide economic downturn. And it affects the global economy in a range of ways. In particular, it has an impact on the British economy. Basically, the US, in response to the crash, decided to introduce their own high tariffs to keep out foreign goods. Okay, so that previous issue we've talked about of British goods not being competitive in the international scene, they're even less competitive in, say, the US, because they've now introduced trade barriers or tariffs to keep out foreign goods if they can. That's the first part. The second part, more significantly, is the American government decides to call in their foreign loans, of which the British are debtors. The British obviously have debt to the Americans, and the Americans decide to call in those loans. The British cannot pay back those loans for two reasons. First, as I mentioned, they can no longer really export goods to the US, as we mentioned, because of the tariffs. So that hurts their ability to pay off loans. The second thing as well is, Britain is a creditor for a lot of other countries. So there are other countries who are heavily in debt to Britain, and so the British decide to try and recall those loans to help them pay back their own loans to the Americans. Obviously, those countries they're trying to recall their loans off are also in deep financial trouble. Therefore, they can't recall their loans off of those countries or their debtors. And as a result, that makes it harder for them to pay off their own loans to the Americans. So you have a situation where the British cannot pay back their debts, or are struggling rather to pay back their debts to the Americans. That's the first thing. The big story, though, of the decades is unemployment. Unemployment is at 7% in 1928. By 1932, the number more than doubles. Again, those are the percentages. If you don't remember the actual numbers because they're quite specific, just in your head remember, unemployment almost doubles. In particular, in some sectors, so it's particularly catastrophic on, again, those heavy industries we've talked about, so things like coal, dock work, cotton, iron/steel, shipbuilding. In some of those industries, unemployment is like 80% in some regions. So it has a particularly adverse effect on some of these heavy industries. Again, because those industries can't sell or export goods anymore, and so the knock-on effect is they have to basically let go of their workers. That increased unemployment puts additional pressures on the government, because with more unemployment, your tax revenue decreases. At the exact same time, the number of people who are actually in need of financial assistance increases. And so you have the double whammy where you've got to pay out more money in terms of unemployment assistance, yet your actual tax bowl, or your tax revenue, basically shrunk because there are less people actually working in the first place. So again, it's one of these sort of double whammies that basically exacerbates the issue even further as a result. So that's the situation with unemployment. So unemployment is the big story of the decade. And then the main number often used to kind of show the extent of the impact. The next major issue, so that's the impact. And so in terms of what the government can do as a solution, there are two sort of competing ideas or ideologies at this time. You've got this sort of internal government dispute. It's a Labour government in charge by this stage, unlucky for them basically. And this dispute basically plays out between two figures in that Labour government, both cabinet ministers, one was very junior. You've got Philip Snowden on the right-hand side, who is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and you have Oswald Mosley, who's a name that you should be familiar with, who is the radical young minister who has this really new, these very cautious, traditional views about the economy. He thinks that British exports will eventually take off again, and what we need to do in the meantime is reduce public expenditure while waiting for the recovery. And there's another reason why he pushes that idea, I'll come back to in a second. On the flip side, though, you have the proposals by Oswald Mosley, which is a document called the Mosley Memorandum. It's basically like a policy document of sorts, like a white paper. And he basically proposes nationalising industries, and more importantly, investing in large-scale public works programmes to reduce unemployment. If that sounds familiar, that's because that's what happens in America with the New Deal, and that's what happens in Germany as well. That's their way of solving problems. So it's actually a very viable and idea that does actually work in other countries. Large-scale investment in public works to create jobs for people. The government in the end decides to reject that idea, and so Mosley's proposal of spending more and investment does not get taken into consideration. Instead, Snowden's idea wins the day, and actually with it comes public spending cuts. And there's another reason why that happens, basically. It's a more sinister, it's a slightly more sinister reason, but it's not a conspiracy. It's very straightforward why this is the case. International banks are largely responsible for why the government decides to cut spending rather than invest in public works. The basic situation is as follows. We've talked about it already. The British government is in debt, or rather, they've racked up a massive war debt. What basically happens is banks actually own a lot of Britain's war debt. Okay, and so in the form of basically pounds or buying pounds. And so what's happened is, if you increase spending on social welfare, okay, basically what you have to end up doing is you're going to have to increase taxation, you're going to have to borrow more. If you increase tax and borrow more, that can potentially affect the value of the pound. If the value of the pound decreases, if these banks have basically brought up lots of British debt through buying lots of pounds, then the value of those pounds they bought decreases quite significantly. And so the banks are put quite significant pressure on the government to basically cut and slash public spending, because if they don't, then they're worried there might be issues with the value of the pound. What actually happens as well is, in the summer of 1931, there are rumours floating around that the government, the Labour government, might actually produce a budget that is actually imbalanced, aka the budget might spend more than it actually receives. In other words, it's going to be borrowing money. There are rumours that the government might start borrowing money to basically spend on some programs. When this rumour floats around, the banks actually start panic selling all of their pounds. When banks start selling their pounds,
You sell pounds.
you just sell them
But for what?
for other currencies.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so there's no selling for other currencies. Yeah, that's what I mean by that. And so when you do that, obviously the value of it starts plummeting quite significantly. And the same with the stocks work. And everyone starts selling it at the same time. Basically, the prices crash. So that actually starts hitting the value of the pound very quickly as a result. And so again, the government gets the message that we need to basically not do anything funny, otherwise we could have some problems with the value of our currency. And so Snowden, the Chancellor, and MacDonald, who is the Prime Minister, both Labour figures, they are forced to cut spending. They literally have no other choice. So their solution to the crisis is basically, we have to cut spending. That causes massive problems in their government. Obviously, being a Labour government, the idea of cutting public spending, because the banks told you to, and in particular, the cuts come out of welfare programs and things like that, causes quite substantial splits in the government. That, as I mentioned in the political landscape topic, that leads to the government splitting, national government gets formed, etc. You know the story behind that.
What theme is this under?
One. So 1B. So what happens is they try to implement the cuts, the government or the Labour Party refuses, and then MacDonald tries to resign, national government gets formed instead. Again, you know how that whole story goes down in the end. So the actual spending cuts themselves get implemented by the coalition government, a coalition that is led in reality by Conservatives, or the majority of the MPs are basically Conservatives. And so what happens as a result is quite significant. Public sector pay gets cut, and more importantly, the really big and very controversial impact of these cuts is the introduction of the means test, unemployment assistance by national government. So people who are receiving unemployment assistance, essentially like unemployment benefits as they would be today, to be eligible for them, the government basically sends round an individual to check your standard of living and to make sure that you are clearly somebody who requires that assistance. It's massively unpopular, it's really humiliating, and of course for a lot of people as well, it means they lose their assistance. It has a disproportionate impact again on the areas on the heavy industrial regions. So unemployment and poverty ends up being quite severe in parts of Tyneside, South Wales, etc. Because of course they've lost their jobs to begin with because of the kind of industry, and as a result the government has now also cut spending on welfare assistance, therefore any actual state help you get in the first place is also cut and reduced in these regions. And kind of the knock-on effect of that, what the really visible impact is at least this phenomenon of hunger marches, where local communities that are basically heavily affected will basically go on these marches towards London to highlight their plight and how much they're suffering, etc. The really famous example of this is the Jarrow Crusade. So some of these people literally walk hundreds of miles to reach London on these long marches. The government's response is really limited, and it's too little too late. So the government does begin to introduce does kind of invest slightly in some programs to help produce jobs. So for example, there's steelworks that create in the Ebb Vale in the south of Wales in about, I think, 35. It brings a few jobs, but it's really too little and it's too late. It's really piecemeal, very small scale projects the government gets involved in. There's no large scale projects. And so in reality, what we can say is for this, so as a result, so the government's only response really in the 30s is to cut spending in terms of, is to cut spending, and they have no solution at all for unemployment. They have no proper solution to solve the issues of unemployment that have come about as a result of depression, and to also therefore help people who've been affected by that in parts of, or in some of these kind of old industrial regions. So that's the negative side of it. However, by the mid-30s, or towards the end of the 30s, it's quite clear that the depression is coming to an end. And actually, the depression in Britain does not last long, especially compared to other countries. So by 1937, by most measures of economic performance, Britain has actually done quite well. So by 37, real incomes, aka your income compared to the cost of goods, in other words, your ability to purchase goods, so real incomes, industrial production, so production output by the industrial sector, exports have all increased by 1937. These are all positive measures or signs of economic growth. Similarly, unemployment has fallen to 8.5%. That is close to its pre-crash level. It got to about 16%, 15% I believe, at the height of the Depression, so it's fallen all the way back down again. So the economy undoubtedly recovers by the end of the 30s. So then we have this question of why does it actually recover? And you could, if you're going to be generous, attribute that to government policies during the 1930s. So if you have this kind of essay question about how effectively government deals with economic problems, you could put the argument that actually they do deal with the depression quite well, when you really consider the kind of long-term outcomes of it. So the first thing they do is they cut interest rates. Cutting interest rates basically allows businesses and individuals to borrow more cheaply, or what you sort of call cheap money, which is able to basically borrow more cheaply. And so as a result, it enables them to spend more, and if businesses can borrow money, it means businesses can now invest in their own business and also create more jobs. So you get jobs being created and you get money being spent as well as the public, like on consumer goods. Additionally, if interest rates are low, it becomes less attractive to save your money in banks because what you gain from the bank itself in interest is obviously reduced. And so people instead, for their investment, choose to invest in properties instead. Okay, it's a solid investment to make. When you invest in property, what ends up happening is, what some people are doing here, is you get a huge housing boom that follows, in the southeast and the Midlands in particular. Okay, what really shows this, in terms of the numbers, the value of mortgages taken out in 1937, aka if you added up all the mortgages in the country, the value of the mortgages that were taken out in 1930 and more than in 1937 are double the 1930 values. I think in 1930 it was something like 300 million, and by 1937 it's something like 600 million. Okay? As a result as well, you have a number of new houses being built dramatically increasing. We've got sort of, so in terms of production as well, there's a housing boom, so both in production and purchasing of houses. A linked point to that, you could have a separate point, you could have it as the same point, although the two things are interlinked, is the government decided to leave the gold standard in 1931. They realised it was a bloody disaster, staying on it is impossible, and so they decided to leave the gold standard. Okay? When you leave the gold standard, what it means is you're able to allow, one of the impacts is, you're able to allow inflation to take place a little bit more instead of trying to prevent it. If you're on the gold standard, you have to try and prevent inflation as much as you can because you're trying to maintain the value of your currency. If inflation is increasing rapidly, that obviously affects the value of your currency, therefore it messes up the gold standard. So when you leave the gold standard, it means the government can actually now allow inflation to take place. What that therefore also means is the government can allow the things that cause inflation to also happen. What causes inflation more than anything else is spending. The more you spend, the more the price of goods increase, the more inflation takes place. And so it means that as a result, you can allow spending to be stimulated, which can also help to produce economic recovery. So leaving the gold standard allows them to do that, and so they kind of introduce policies that allow people to spend more money, which I've kind of already talked about now because I'm cutting interest rates, and that allows you to recover. And there's a double effect as well leaving the gold standard. That's one part of it. The other part of it, the problem from the 20s, which it created, aka making exports harder, obviously gets eliminated, or eradicated rather. It allows British exports to become cheaper and therefore more competitive as a result on an international stage. So British industry is also able to recover more and export more as a result when they decide to leave the gold standard. And so the net result of all of that is that by the end of the 30s, the economy has basically recovered almost fully. There is an argument to be made that actually it's due to the war coming about, the war forces, war production, etc. But by that stage, to be honest, the economy recovered already. And in terms of other recoveries in international trade. But I think we can give the government credit for this one, to be honest. And it's also a more obvious point to mention about government success, because they're quite few and far between for this period. Okay, so that's the Second World War. Oh, sorry, that's the interwar period. Headaches. Okay, so the Second World War, as and this is a comment and an issue which is going to constantly recur for every theme you look at. The Second World War can be seen to be a reason or a catalyst for, or rather, reason for creating a revolution in British society for a range of reasons. So it could be argued that the Second World War basically helps to create an economic revolution as well. Obviously, conventional economic thinking, the start of the century, or 19th century British economic policy, it's sort of classical liberalism. The government does not intervene significantly in the economy. The government should actually keep its nose out of people's affairs. The government should not really spend too much. They shouldn't tax people too highly. It's not really their responsibility, their role to provide for most people, or in a comprehensive way, really. The Second World War, though, basically helps change that. And war is often basically a time in which extension of state power is basically accepted. Obviously, when there is a more serious threat, aka the threat of an enemy taking over, etc., people accept certain things that they wouldn't normally accept. And therefore, it's often a great time for social experiments as well. And so, the Second World War sees a massive growth in the power of the state. So the state controls things like food and fuel rationing. They put restrictions on press freedom. They basically conscript workers. But then even essentially you could Britain in many ways resembles a full-on socialist state during the Second World War, in the sense that they basically control large sectors of the economy. You've got a situation whereby workers get forced or directed to work in certain sectors. They have no real choice. The government decides where they need workers to be to help improve war output, production, etc. And so you as a worker will be told to go in that sector, and you don't really have a significant choice in the matter. Additionally, they control things like wages. They control the hours people work. They take control of certain industries as well completely. They fully nationalise them. So in many ways, the war sees the British economy almost transform into a socialist state, or it could be argued that way at least. And so what it does then is, because actually the government ends up doing a decent job of it, or they do a decent job, and so it helps lead to this atmosphere and acceptance that government actually often does know best, and the war is therefore responsible, the government does know best, and therefore is actually in some ways responsible, for example, for things like providing a high and stable level of employment. The government itself in 1944 basically announces that, it sees its responsibility, or parts of responsibilities, as doing that. Which was something which it never would have seen as a responsibility 50 years prior to that. And so you get a situation where, coming out of the Second World War, economic thinking is shifting towards acceptance of state intervention, greater state intervention in the economy, etc. These are things we've already talked about when we're looking at the consensus politics that follows the Second World War. It's things like a commitment to full employment, so the government should try and maintain jobs for everybody in the country. There's a commitment to state nationalisation of a large range of industries, commitment to things like a welfare state, etc. So the question then is, how effectively do Labour and Conservative governments tackle the problems that follow the Second World War, the problems that come about between 45 and 79. I've kind of put 1970. The reason being for that, as you're going to see when I finish this next section, I think it's quite difficult to argue that there is any kind of... basically what it boils down to, the 70s are basically a bit of a lost decade. It just, all shit hits the fan, basically. It's very difficult to solve anything, and I feel like they quite often, or they more likely ask a question about, in terms of effectiveness of dealing with problems, about 45 to 70. I'll also mention what happens in the 70s as well. Anyway, so, coming out of the Second World War, so Labour faces a range of problems. First of all, the Americans end this thing called the Lend-Lease system, which was another way in which the Americans were helping the British finance the Second World War. The British were actually lucky to get financial help in the Second World War from the Americans. The reason being they actually defaulted on their First World War loan, and they didn't want to lend them any money in the Second World War. They basically had to in the end. So they end their agreement to basically lend them money. Second issue they're facing are the increasing costs of maintaining a standing army and international commitments. The Labour government makes decisions to basically be involved in certain economic or certain international conflicts, aka Korea. They also decide to pursue nuclear armament or nuclear weapons. That obviously has its own quite substantial costs. So you have these serious costs that arise from spending on things like defence in the army, etc. The next issue is the recurring financial problems that were not really solved from before the Second World War. So there's a continued issue of the national debt being quite high. There's also the continued problem of there being a trade imbalance, or there's a trade imbalance whereby Britain is now importing more than it exports. And so Labour, basically, as a government, decides to focus heavily on trying to increase exports. In fact, take a very drastic measure of devaluing the British pound from $4 to $2.80 to basically help make exports cheaper as a result. That's the first thing they do. Second thing, to try and increase or to try and raise funds to pay for a lot of their programs, they basically negotiate the Marshall Aid, so essentially loans by the Americans that are basically designed to help ravaged Europe. And so Britain receives close to £3 billion from them to help pay for rebuilding. And a lot of that actually helps to finance a lot of the welfare state which was created after the Second World War. The final thing though as well is that eventually, there's a bit of a contradiction, by the end of this period, they also implement aspects of austerity, aka cutting back the welfare state a little bit, despite actually creating it. So as the costs really start to bite, in 1951, it was 1951, they actually introduced prescription charges in the NHS, for example, to help raise costs or make it a bit more financially viable. So the question is, how successful are they? So you could argue their policies are successful between 45 to 51. First things first, full employment is achieved. When we say full employment, it doesn't mean every single person's got a job. That can never really be achieved. But unemployment falls to just under 300,000 people. That is much, much lower than at any point during the previous decades. So they're hugely successful in dragging down unemployment figures. Additionally, the focus on exports does actually pay off. World trade can basically improve for Britain, and so exports grow by nearly 80%, and so their devaluing of the pound to try and increase them aggressively pays off. Lastly, economic growth also increases. About 4% each year. You could argue that's a good amount, but as you'll see in a moment, we're going to mention how actually that amount isn't as impressive as it could have been. So I'll estimate that the Labour government basically is successful in tackling those significant personal problems. On the flip side, you can argue their policies are unsuccessful, or that they fail. The first thing is they fail again to modernise properly modernised industry. It's the same recurring problem from the 1920s, whereby British industry, traditional heavy industry, is inefficient and needs investment to make it more effective. And so there's a chap called Craig Barnett who basically argues that actually investing in a welfare state after the Second World War was a massive mistake. Because actually what they should have done was invested in infrastructure. So investing in a welfare state as opposed to infrastructure and industries prevents Britain from re-establishing itself as a major manufacturing economy. Unlike West Germany, which does the opposite basically and manages to pick up. And so there's an argument actually that the reason why exports pick up isn't because of Labour policy, it's because actually other countries are in a worse off state, and so Britain comes out of the war filling a vacuum basically. And so actually the British don't really have, or rather Labour doesn't really have very good economic policies, and actually it's quite problematic long term. And then of course there's the argument that their commitment to military spending and nuclear weapons, and that commitment to the previous point as well actually, forces the government to adopt austerity policies. This commitment to the previous point, because again, if you compare Britain to the other countries after the Second World War, for example Japan and West Germany, if you compare the amount of money they spend in terms of percent of GDP on development project, infrastructure, industry, and you compare to weapons, the British spending a much higher percentage on weapons basically than weapons development. And what that does is again arguably it slows down or restricts the ability of British industry to become more competitive going forward. So I think it can swing both ways in terms of how you weigh the policy. So what I'm going to run through then basically are a range of issues that come about from 1951 to 1970 and how well the government deals with that particular issue. So I'm going to run through about 4 issues basically, or three problems, and how 4 or 5 problems and how the government deals with them. So the first one is the issue of consumer spending. After the Second World War, rather after 1951, this is often seen as kind of the birth of Britain's consumer society. And so you have Hal Macmillan, who is the Conservative Prime Minister. He's faced with this problem of increased consumer affluence. In other words, people borrowing and spending more than ever before. Why is that? Probably you might say. Spending is to be encouraged, but as I mentioned kind of beforehand, spending often comes with a price and a consequence, and that's inflation. And so as Britain starts spending significantly in the 50s, as they become a consumer society, one of the consequences is inflation. And so that also, so that's the first part of it, it leads to inflation. The second part of it as well is, the second major problem, is British consumerism leads to more imports coming into the country. Britons have a taste for a lot of foreign goods. That again comes up to the same old problem of a balance of payments issue. If you've got British people spending lots of money on foreign consumer goods, you've got a trade imbalance developing once again. You're not exporting that much, and you're bringing in a lot of goods into the country. And so the country is losing money as well.
So British people are spending too much money on foreign goods and not on British goods, or?
They do on both, but with spending on foreign goods as well, it brings in imports, and imports basically increase. So it's all well and good if you're exporting, but if your imports are also massively increasing, it kind of offsets that advantage, and so you end up still losing money basically.
So not a lot of exports?
There are exports okay, but there's still more imports coming in. So yeah, there's a trading balance as a result. So the government solution is something which I'm familiar with from last year. It's a little phrase that might be slightly memorable. So the government basically policies are nicknamed, or rather sort of mocked by the press, as stop-go economics. The government's response is basically, whenever inflation goes up, the government raises interest rates. The idea being, if you raise interest rates, it makes it harder to borrow, therefore it makes it harder to spend money. Therefore, spending decreases, and of course, inflation gets controlled. So when inflation goes up, they try to slow down spending by increasing interest rates. And then, if they, similarly, on the flip side, if they then want to increase spending again, what they then do is decrease interest rates. And so the government basically operates what they call these, what the press calls these stop-go cycles. When the government needs to decrease inflation, they increase interest rates, and then when they want to increase spending, they decrease interest rates, and they juggle the two back and forth to kind of solve the issues as they come along. So what that demonstrates is it demonstrates the failure of the government to develop a consistent long-term strategy for growth. Okay, because the government's instead always using short-term measures to deal with problems in the economy. They have no long-term plan. They're dealing with issues as they come about. They have no long-term plan at all. And this demonstrates that failure. So that's the first thing. You can argue they failed to solve the consumer spending issue. The second issue that they face is that, and I've kind of referenced it already, is that of being outperformed by international rivals. Britain is being dramatically outperformed by major international rivals, in particular, again, countries like, it's the usual suspects, Japan, West Germany. This is even worse considering those two countries had both emerged from, or rather both countries had basically had devastating consequences from the war, aka large base. I mean, if you look at Japan, pretty much all of their cities being destroyed during the Second World War by like firebombing. Like their entire country is just leveled to the ground, pretty much. or most of the major countries. So then when you consider that in 1960, Japan has economic growth of 12% per year in 1960, whereas Britain's growing at 4% per year. And so suddenly you have this issue whereby foreign countries or foreign rivals are actually outperforming Britain as international economies. And so clearly, although the Britain's doing all right, compared to their rivals, they're not doing so well at all. And so the government solution is, again, one that doesn't work so well, arguably. Macmillan basically begins to implement what they call corporatist policies. I'm going to emphasize what this corporatist stuff means, what corporatism is, because it's a word to kind of make sure you understand. Corporatist policies, they are basically policies surrounding how you come up with, or rather, it's an ideology about how you come up with economic policy, or rather, even not just economic, in general, how you come up with state policy. And so corporatist policies basically suggest that you bring, or corporatism basically is the idea that you bring together labour, aka the workers, the unions, big business, aka the management, so you bring together the labour, the workers, the management, the businesses, and the government, and together they sort of get together and plan and negotiate how to achieve economic goals, okay? So in a nutshell, you give unions, so labour unions, and also big businesses, direct say in terms of what policies are implemented, in terms of negotiations, etc. The government will actually directly negotiate and discuss with them what to do with the economy. That's a simple way of understanding it. Okay? And so the government, or rather Macmillan's government, creates two bodies. One of them's called NEDI, the other one's called NICI. They're basically acronyms. I can't remember what the acronyms are for, but I just remember those names, NEDI and NICI. And these are two bodies, or organisations, that essentially are created to discuss economic development. So the first one, NEDI, is literally, they get together and they discuss goals and economic development. That's a bit of a vague one. The second one's more straightforward to understand. NICI, basically, is an organisation created, again, the unions are involved in it, the government's involved in it, businesses, to discuss and set guidance on pay increases. The idea is they get together and they decide what is a reasonable pay increase. People, of course, expect to have their wages increase. This body's role is to discuss what can be considered reasonable pay increases, aka not too much, but enough so that people can live. Okay? The idea being that if pay keeps going up far too much, that can cause issues. Again, related to things like inflation, for example, people are spending too much money. However, these bodies fail ultimately, and the reason being both bodies, they have no real power. It's basically advisory only. In particular with NICI, which again is meant to deal with wage restraint, to convince unions to kind of accept lower pay rises, the unions completely ignore their guidance. The idea was that the unions would basically voluntarily accept it because it's more the responsible thing to do. However, if you bear in mind that the union members themselves are people growing up in a consumerist world, they've grown up watching people spend more and more, this nature of the society, that basically people demand more consumer goods. People aren't willing to accept pay restraint, and so the union, the bosses themselves, refuse to accept it because members won't accept it. And so corporatism fails. The government is not really able to bring about these solutions, or rather for these organisations don't really work. The idea was, between them, these groups would get together, they would produce shared economic goals and visions, and as a result they'd all work brilliantly together in harmony, and the economy would do well, and they'd start growing significantly. Kind of in a way that basically socialist states work. But yeah, it didn't really work out in the end. So corporatist attempts to basically produce a more efficient economy, or more growth, etc., don't really work. And mainly because organisations themselves have no real power, you could argue. Okay, this next one's basically more confusing. So that's basically in the Macmillan government. Macmillan government is from 57 to 63. The next issue which comes about is the threat of devaluation. And what this basically means is the following. By 1964, increased consumer spending had led to a balance of payments problem. Okay, we've mentioned this already, there's a balance of payments issue. And so, when you have balance of payments issues, the solution is you need to try and get exports up desperately. Okay, and so with balance of payments issue, what you often are threatened with is devaluation. Because if you want to increase exports, you want your currency to be cheaper because then you can sell more abroad. So, you basically deliberately lower the value of your currency. So remember I said, Labour do it after the Second World War to try and increase exports. But it's not something that you should be relying on as a country over and over again, because if you devalue your currency, what happens to people's spending power? The money in the pocket is worth less. Right, it's not, yeah, exactly, it can't spend as much. The currency itself is worth less, and so it's not something which you constantly do, because it obviously has negative consequences. And so the Conservatives initially, in 1961, resist the temptation to devalue the currency, fearing that, again, it's not really going to have positive consequences. So they don't do that. So the kind of this issue kind of maintains itself. So eventually, what happens is Harold Wilson is basically forced to devalue. Attempts to make British exports more competitive by other means basically fail. Harold Wilson tries to introduce plans that sort of make the economy sort of more efficient, to kind of create this new technological revolution. It doesn't really work out so well. And so by 1967, Harold Wilson is basically forced to devalue the pound from $2.80 to $2.40. So basically, that's a loss of value of about, I think, 14% or something like that. He famously claims, when he devalues the pound, that it would not affect the value of the pound in your pocket, to try and sort of sort out or sort of allay the concerns of the average British public member of the public. Having said that, it's not true. In reality, it does devalue, or it does affect the value of the pound in their pocket, as it were. It's also an unpopular measure, and it causes quite a lot of anger within his cabinet, who kind of get upset about the whole situation. Again, at last leads us into the 70s. I would hope that it could be 70, but it could come up, in which case, again, the solutions don't really work so well. So, 1970, so this is fast forwarding to 1970, we've got Ted Heath now is in charge, a Conservative leader, and so against the backdrop of him coming into power, inflation is basically rising quite rapidly. Inflation is rising globally, and inflation in Britain is now hitting 15%, which is a huge amount. This is in the first year and a half of Ted Heath's government. Additionally, unemployment has also started to rise from its 50s rate. So in the 1950s, unemployment was at 2%. By the 70s, it's now at 6%. So he faces the issue of inflation and unemployment. His solution to these problems is basically to try and create. He desperately decides to try and create growth during the 1970s. It's not even that specifically because of inflation and unemployment. It's because that's what he wants to do. And so his actions basically make the situation worse. He tries to create growth. The way he does it is by cutting taxes and trying to borrow less money. So he wants to lower borrowing and cut taxes. However, a huge spike in inflation again occurs, and this gets worsened by the 1973 oil crisis. The 1973 oil crisis, not going to go into the details of why it happens, but essentially, Arab states cut oil production and also increased the price of oil. That has a massive knock-on effect on every other sector, because suddenly If fuel is now more expensive, guess what else costs more money? Transport costs more money. Transporting goods is more expensive. Therefore, those goods you're transporting become more expensive. That's just one example. So with the oil crisis, cost of goods increase substantially, even more so than they previously had. So inflation continues to spiral out of control. And so Heath decides to, as in consequence, a solution, 1973, to cut public sector pay. He decides to try and cut public sector pay. Again, issue which you will be familiar with when we look at the unions. He tries to cut their pay, and that has disastrous consequences. The National Union of Miners goes on strike. And this story we're going to go into in a lot of detail when we look at the unions, but in short, the unions go on, the miners go on strike. The miners' strike brings the government to its knees, and a 3-day working week gets declared, state of emergency, and the economy basically tanks as a result.
So the NUM strike is the 3-day working week?
Yeah, NUM strike causes a 3-day working week. And so again, so you can say categorically, Heath's attempts to solve problems in the economy are a complete failure. Categorically. So, problems to end the decade, and I'll wrap this one up right here. Problems to end the decade. The pound's value falls even further by the middle of the decade. With the pound's value falling further, that leads to massive budget deficits. When I say budget deficits, what I mean by that is the amount which the government is having to borrow every single year to spend money is massively increasing because the pound's value is falling. The government, therefore, is forced to ask for a loan from IMF, the International Monetary Fund, of £3 billion. However, with massive spending cuts required as a condition, so the IMF says, okay, fine, you can have the loan, but you must cut spending significantly. That basically creates even further chaos within the Labour government, and that Labour government, therefore, goes into kind of civil war and sort of collapses or gets destroyed at elections within by 1979. And so they're not really able to solve that problem as a result. Yeah, and that kind of wraps up the decade, basically. The 70s ends with the economy in a worse state than it's ever been in before, or rather in this entire period, in the post-war period. And so that's sort of like, basically bookends that chapter. And that's how the decade ends, with significant economic problems which the government has not been able to solve. And that's a wrap for that one.
Oh, that was heavy. Are you doing this one today as well?